you very much. Is this working with the microphone? Thank you very much for these nice words. It's a bit embarrassing to try to match that, especially because it makes me look so successful. Now, it may be interesting for you to know, because, well, how do you define success? No, success is the ability to make a plan and then actually to make it come true, to achieve it, to realize that. Now, it may be interesting for you to know I never planned to become a special rapporteur on torture, a professor of international law in Glasgow, or any of these other functions. I wanted to be an astronaut. So, here's my success, right? I always wanted to be an astronaut because when I was an exchange student, I was 17, I was sent to the US for a year to go to school. And I was hosted by a very generous host family in Orlando, Florida. And my host father was a NASA engineer. And so he introduced me to some of the astronauts who had actually flown to the moon. And I met the commander of the last moon landing who had spent 3.5 days on the moon, and he explained to me what it looks like when you look at the Earth standing on the moon. He said, you take a couple of seconds of the precious time you have with all the checklists and everything, you just got to switch off the radio and look at that spectacular planet, and you can actually see it turn in front of your eyes. And you see there are no political borders. And it's just the most beautiful sight in the universe. And that somehow did something to me. It has become an iconic picture. So obviously I went back to Switzerland. I applied to become an Army or Air Force pilot, and so I received this pack of materials I had to study for the entry exam. And so the first one was about this thick. It was about aerodynamics. And I wasn't very good at math, and I wasn't very good at physics either. And I was not really interested in studying stars or stones or so the chemistry wasn't, I was almost failed at chemistry. So there was really nothing I could offer to become an astronaut. And it pulled me towards studying law. And I had, believe it or not, when you're 15 years old and you say you want to become an astronaut, everybody thinks it's cute. When you're 25 and you just did your master's in law, and you still walk around saying you actually want to become an astronaut, it's not cute anymore, especially when you tell that to an employer. So it took me a walk along the lake in Zurich in Switzerland, where I grew up also, to meet an old man. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it's true, who had spent his life advising companies in developing visions, their corporate visions. And we sat next to each other on the bench, and he asked me, so young man, what are your plans? I mean, what is your profession? I said, well, I just did my master's in law. And he said, what are your plans? And I said, well, to be honest, I'd like to fly to the moon. And he said, that's interesting. And he actually helped me understand that this is not about me physically flying to the moon, but it's the perspective. The thing that always inspired me is to stand on firm ground. I never wanted to land on the far side of the moon or be the first man on Mars or something like this. I always wanted to be on the moon and see what these astronauts had seen, see our Earth from there in its beauty and its entirety. And that really made me understand that I actually am a lawyer, an international lawyer, with the perspective of an astronaut. I'm looking at law from a universal perspective. I'm not studying national legal frameworks and local regulations. I've always studied the rules that connect us as humanity. What are the rules that are universal, that apply to everyone, regardless of where they are on the planet, what religion they confess to, whatever their beliefs and political systems are, what is the kind of connecting lowest common denominator, the basic standards and principles that connect all of us. And so now I do have that perspective, and that's how I look at my work every day. Through my work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the laws of armed conflict, basic humanitarian standards, they're universal. They apply to all human beings the same way. Clearly, now a mandate on the prohibition of torture is also something that applies to every person in the world equally. No one wants to be tortured. No one should ever be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. I've had a long parcours, as we say in French, a long career through various functions, and I've been able to touch upon very interesting topics. And they have been mentioned, including some of the technological challenges we have today, autonomous weapons, cyber security, and I'll certainly be happy to try to connect those to what I'm discussing here, and also to answer to your questions that you may have with regard to these issues. But what I'd like to focus on is to introduce my current function on the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and also, what my function is, and what torture really is. I'd like to discuss that with you, what the challenges are perhaps today in this area. So, let me quickly see whether I can, this doesn't become autonomous. Right, so quickly, in this presentation, I'll go through a couple of slides, but they really should be a basis for our discussion. In the beginning, I'll talk a bit more, but I will probably try to involve you quite quickly here so we can see what is of most interest to you as well. So the human right against torture was first universally codified in the Article 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is this towering instrument that was established and agreed on after the Second World War in order to prevent the atrocities of that war from ever returning. So it basically aspired to establish a new world order based on human dignity and human rights. And there we can see in Article 5, it says, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. This rule is universally recognized as being absolute and non-derogable. Don't worry, it will not become too technical. As customary and as a general principle of law. This is something for law students because these are the three sources of international law: treaty law, customary law, and general principles of law. I won't go into the theory of this. All I want to say is if a rule is recognized in international law to be absolute and non-derogable, it means that it's absolute, there are no exceptions, and it cannot be derogated from, it cannot be deviated from under any circumstance. Not because there is a natural disaster, not because there is war, economic crisis, or other exceptional circumstances. Right? Even in times of crisis, prohibition of torture is absolute and cannot be deviated from. So it's probably the most strong, or would I say most recognized human right in the world. Now, if I talk about torture, or if we talk about torture, it's important for us to be aware of the images we all carry in our minds. Maybe I put it to you. Maybe some of you can tell me, what do you think of spontaneously when we speak of torture? And don't try to give an accurate definition. Just what is your image? The first thing that comes up when I say torture.
Pain.
Pain.
Waterboarding.
Waterboarding. War. You have to speak louder.
Degradation.
Okay. Mental torture? Right. So how would you, now if I asked you to, in a sentence, describe what torture is, how do you describe it? Unfair treatment, all right. Unnecessary. Right. Now, okay, so you say unfair, but not every unfair treatment would be torture. Repetitive? But what kind of unfair treatment, what kind of repetitive treatment? I mean, it's not every unfair, you know.
Someone of a length of power imposing that one to someone like
so imposing power, dominance, right?
An abuse of power.
Abuse. Is there any limits to, you know, any threshold that you should pay? You spoke of pain. Is that a requirement? Should it be extreme pain?
Fear.
Fear.
Humiliation.
Humiliation. Degrading treatment. Yeah, and there are lots of elements, you know. No? Now, this is the treaty definition. Now, let me tell you from experience, when treaty definitions are very long, the longer they get, the more loopholes there are. Right? The shortest, you know, the shortest and most straightforward prohibitions are the clear ones. As soon as they get very long, there is reason to be a little bit suspicious. So let me break it down for you. Well, here, the Article 1 of the UN Convention Against Torture says that any act by which severe pain or suffering, so obviously I underlined the relevant elements, whether physical or mental, so we have mental pain as well, is intentionally inflicted, so it has to be intentional, not by negligence or so, for such purposes as, so it has to be purposeful, right? Obtaining from him or her or a third person information or a confession, so that's the interrogation kind of context. Punishing him or her for an act he or she or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind. So that's quite broad. And then from then on it says it also requires the involvement of a public official. And such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in official capacity. And there is then in the treaty one exception. It says it does not include pain or suffering arising from, only from, or inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. So that is very long. The main elements really are those put down here. Infliction of severe pain or suffering. It can be physical or mental. Clearly, as soon as you have an adjective in a treaty, severe, that will be the point of discussion. What is severe, right? Then intent, that is quite straightforward. Intent in international law does not mean desire. It means that it's foreseeable, that in the ordinary course of events, of your actions, prohibited results will occur. It's sufficient. Intent does not necessarily mean the desire to cause the result, but you know you will most likely cause these results. What they call dolus eventualis in the continental legal systems. It has to be purposeful. So that's what makes torture so much worse than other forms of cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment, is that it instrumentalizes deliberately pain and suffering in order to achieve a purpose. That's what's so dehumanizing, that it is intentionally inflicted with the intent to use it as a tool. It's not, for example, in war, where obviously fighting will cause severe, legitimate, tragic or legitimate fighting between combatants will cause severe suffering. But the point of the fighting is not to cause suffering. It's a consequence of the fighting that you might not be able to avoid. So that's not torture, you see? But it's when you're actually deliberately causing the pain and suffering, because precisely that's what you want to do in order to coerce a person, for example, or intimidate them. That's the essence of torture. The involvement of state agents is in the treaty because the treaty obliges only states. That is the human rights treaty. But torture is not something that cannot be done by private actors. It's just that it won't be prohibited by the human rights treaty, that it will be simply prohibited in criminal law, right? Or in the law of armed conflict for armed groups and so on. But what is important is really the essence of torture is using suffering and pain to achieve a purpose. And I just hammer this in because you will see that when we start to apply it to certain contexts, how important that understanding is, but especially when we get out of the kind of classic interrogation of torture era, and we get into what is called enhanced interrogation methods, or kind of deep interrogation, it was called in the UK, it was in the Northern Ireland context. The CIA used to call it in the 80s human intelligence exploitation. I mean, there's plenty of euphemisms that you can use to describe torture. And usually the purpose is to disguise methods that are nothing else but torture and give them some kind of the cloak of legitimacy. The problem is, in practice, really a bit of the, in some areas, one of the problems I encounter in practice is this exclusion of lawful sanctions. The treaty says that lawful sanctions cannot be regarded as torture. That obviously is an issue when I talk to the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, and they say, well, you know, in our country the Sharia applies, and the Sharia requires corporal punishment, so that's a lawful sanction in our systems, and therefore that's not torture. Well, the first response there was, I see your point, Ambassador, but well, that can be then, as a first step, agree that it's only sanctions and not interrogations. Right? So you cannot use these types of measures certainly as an interrogation. So there he granted that, but then we're very quickly stuck. And I have to go to other areas of the law where Saudi Arabia has ratified the Geneva Conventions that say that even for enemies in war, corporal punishment is absolutely prohibited. And so I said, well, how can you do to your own citizens and make that legal what you can't do to your enemies in armed conflict? And so we're a bit stuck at that level because quite intentionally states incorporated that loophole. It's not only with corporal punishment, it's also with issues such as the death penalty. Right? The death penalty, almost by definition, causes severe pain and suffering. Even if the execution method is quick and presumably clean, very often the time before the so-called death row syndrome is enormously torturous and painful for the convict, but also for the families of these people. And so, in my view, it is almost impossible to practice the death penalty without automatically violating the prohibition of torture and treatment. But then obviously the states would, in their practice, the retentionist states, if you take the death penalty, they would say, well, you know, but this is a lawful sanction, so we can't challenge that. So I'm not here to claim that the international legal framework is perfect. I'm actually here to be very honest about it. International law, the treaty rules are made by states in the interest of states for their own purposes. And so it's not a coincidence, as you see, and that's just one example, that's why I stay so long on it, where you can see how a very long definition contains all kinds of loopholes. One is that, the lawful sanctions. We have a case that I recently intervened in that is connected indirectly with the Assange case. That's the case of Chelsea Manning, who's the informant, the former army private who actually leaked the information that WikiLeaks then published in 2010. And she was initially convicted to 35 years in prison for that, which is about the amount of, you know, of imprisonment that the length of imprisonment that you would expect for someone in The Hague, who actually was one of the main war criminals in Yugoslavia conflict. So enormously harsh sanction for not having killed anybody. But so she received these 35 years. She was then pardoned after 7 years by Obama on his last day of office, but she's now again in prison, and that's the point I'm getting to. Because she does not want to testify against Assange in the grand jury. And so the grand jury ordered her detention, or the judge ordered her detention, and it's a form of coercive detention. So she will be detained until she testifies. And it's a form of coercing her. And she's, on top of it, being fined $1,000 fine every day that she doesn't testify, which is accumulated to about $300,000 by now. Now, I'm not saying that, it can be a legal duty to testify in court in a criminal case, unless if it's not self-incriminating, and if it's not incriminating close family members, it can be a citizen's duty to do so. And not doing so can be an offense. And in my opinion, it is absolutely legitimate to punish someone like that with a proportionate sentence. But then it's a defined sentence, and once you have served it, the story is done. Right? What you can see here is that increasingly, progressively severe suffering is inflicted. It's not after 3 days of detention, but after 300 days, 600 days, and even more. Obviously, it becomes increasingly coercive. So you're having progressively severe mental suffering in this case, being inflicted. The pressure also, obviously, of the financial debts that increases every day, that she will never be able to pay back. And the purpose, it's intentionally being done to coerce her to testify. So the only question is here, is it a lawful sanction? Not. It is torture. And the concept of a lawful sanction is precisely the open-ended, indefinite, coercive sanctions really are not. It's a contradiction to the concept of a criminal sanction that is, has to be measured, has to be measured to individual culpability, but then it is definite. You can't have an open-ended, indefinite sanction that has a coercive purpose. That's precisely the difference with torture. So I did intervene to the US officially and asked them to draw their attention to that contradiction to the Convention Against Torture, and asked them to also change their legislation in order to prevent that in the future. They have so far not felt it was necessary to respond. But that's just also an example to show how broad these loopholes can be, from corporal punishment to these types of sanctions. The other one obviously is, well, what is severe suffering? Sometimes you see governments say, well, we introduce enhanced interrogation or special interrogation measures. None of them will, are called severe suffering. For example, making people stand for hours on end and making them take stressed positions, depriving them of sleep, under the excuse, on the excuse that we have long interrogation sessions. So obviously it's always disguised as having a different purpose, but when you accumulate, for example, solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, with implicit threats, and then uncomfortable positions, you can just put someone on a chair that has 3 legs instead of 4. And one is just 15 centimeters shorter than the others. Doesn't sound like torture, does it? But if you spend hours and hours in a chair like this, and you can never relax, you're always, in a sensitive position, maybe not sufficient in itself, but it's a factor that makes you really uncomfortable, and at some point very uncomfortable, cramps and everything. But you continue then to add other layers to that, and you can create an environment that in the end is so coercive that the person breaks. And clearly, because we have this express, prohibition of torture now, at the same time that we have that, we see states starting to develop methods that don't leave physical traces, that are not readily identifiable as torture. So we can get to more of that just to get quickly through, because the mandate is not only torture, there's other cruel and human degrading treatment. What the treaty says here is that other cruel and human degrading treatment that does not amount to torture, obviously, is also prohibited. Actually, I think we don't have to belabor it too much. What it basically means is that where intention is missing, or purposefulness is missing. For example, when you have prison guards that, and I see that very often, unfortunately, when I visit countries, in prisons, especially in developing countries, that guards that have a very low salary, they keep part of the food, or they keep part of the food budget. And so the quality of the food in prisons is deplorable in many countries in the world. Not necessarily because there is no budget, but because the budget simply disappears. And so the families have to feed the prisoners. But in many contexts, in big countries like, for example, Argentina or other huge countries where families may be sometimes thousands of kilometers away, or certainly hundreds of kilometers away, and don't have the means to come and provide the food, very quickly you will have inhumane detention conditions. Now that's not because the guards wants to make the detainees suffer. It's simply corruption. I'm not justifying it, obviously it's not justified, but it's not purposeful. So that's what we mean with cruel and inhuman degrading treatment. Is you're not purposefully inflicting it on the person, but you're causing it, sometimes even knowingly, but it is not that you want to instrumentalize it against that particular person. It can be negligence also, simply, often in the detention contexts, guards not taking enough care. We see in many of the migration camps around the world. We've certainly read all these news stories of the deplorable conditions in some of these camps. And that may not always be intentional. Sometimes it is. In some contexts, migrants are being intentionally kept in conditions that are so hard that they should be coerced to withdraw their asylum requests. They're being told, no, you're not being detained, you can leave at any time, but you have to go back. Right? It's a bit what they told Assange, right? In the Ecuadorian embassy, oh, you're free to leave any time. Well, any political refugee is free to leave any time. It's just that when they leave, they will be exposed to serious violations of human rights, and that's why they are political refugees. They're all voluntarily where they are, because wherever else they go, they will be threatened seriously in their life and human rights. And so the question really is not whether someone is voluntarily somewhere, but whether he has a acceptable possibility to go back, to go out. And that applies to a person like Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy just as much as it applies to the irregular migrants in some of these camps around the world. Whether we speak of Libya or Mexico, and the Australian islands, or the Australian controlled detention facilities on these islands. You may be interested to know actually that Guantanamo originally was not conceived as a counterterrorism prison, but it was actually a migration outpost to keep all the migrants coming from the Caribbean towards the US, to keep them offshore so they would not get into the jurisdiction and the constitutional rights of the US. But basically, so simply, if you keep in mind, torture is intentionally instrumentalizing pain because you want to achieve a purpose. And other cruel and inhuman degrading treatment is when that purposefulness is missing. Yeah? Or you even have neglect, but still the result is cruel, inhuman, or degrading. Now what, if you have that prohibition, that prohibition is absolutely what are the obligations? There are 5 main obligations. One is to prevent. States have to prevent within their jurisdiction, within their territory, any territorial control, they have to prevent. I see the next slide down here, so that I don't see that it's not up here. They have to prevent torture and ill-treatment from happening. They have to take all measures that they can, legislative measures, they have to make laws, regulations, judicial measures to prevent torture from being perpetrated in their territory by their officials, but even by private actors. To remember that prohibition was that states can even permit that by acquiescence. So, for example, I gave a report on domestic violence to the General Assembly last year. And I was asked by some of the ambassador, Mr. Rapporteur, why are you reporting domestic violence? Because that has nothing to do with states and nothing to do with torture. And then they said, well, you're trivializing torture. And then I had to answer to one of the ambassadors, well, Ambassador, with all due respect, I think you're trivializing domestic violence. Because when you think of some of the contexts that frequently, unfortunately, domestic violence is extremely cruel. You have systematic abuse, sexual abuse, life-threatening injuries. We've had, in 2018, 70,000 femicide, women murdered in the world, of which 50,000 were killed by family members. And that's only just the women, then you have children, you have also men being killed by their families. In fact, when you compare the numbers of victims, dead and injured, caused by all armed conflicts together in a given time period, it's just about on par with what is caused by domestic violence in the world that we know about. That's probably just the tip of the iceberg, because most of it is not even reported. So it's an enormously violent context. The most violent context in the world is the home. It's hard to believe. I couldn't believe when I started researching these things how much suffering is caused in the four walls of the homes. And how difficult it is, obviously, for victims to come forward, because not only do authorities hesitate to get involved, because they think it's a private matter, but then they're also in this emotional conflict that the persons that they depend on, and very often also are emotionally attached to, are actually the ones that abuse them, and that if they lose these people because they get arrested, they not only have loyalty conflict, but very often they're also out of economic support. And so, just saying, even that is part of my mandate. That's it. Well, the prohibition, remember, says, or the convention says that states have to prevent that from happening, and that when officials are just acquiescent in, they know about this type of abuse, but they don't intervene, that already amounts to torture. And so there is a lot of clarification to be made. When I took over this mandate, I thought, what am I going to do? The prohibition of torture has been there since, 60 years or 70 years, and it's clear. I mean, everybody recognizes it, everybody knows what's torture. We're going to write to the General Assembly every year, and to the Human Rights Council every year, in terms of thematic, discussion with the public. And actually, I was surprised to see how many areas there are in the world where people are purposefully, intentionally subjected to severe pain and suffering, and no one even speaks of torture. Domestic violence, migrants, in the context of corruption, in the context of police violence, police brutality, outside of the custody context, arrests, street checkpoints, harassment that occurs in these contexts. It's enormous. It's absolutely enormous. In the healthcare system, we have people being institutionalized against their will, but legally it's not involuntary because their legal capacity has been stripped. For example, people with a mental impairment, their legal capacity, stripped of their legal capacity, and so it's someone deciding for them. And as soon as whoever represents them agrees with the institutionalization, it counts as voluntary. And so when I ask a state, and I visit a state to evaluate their places of deprivation of liberty, they will not put that on the list because they're all there voluntarily. Behind bars and sometimes chains and in cages, but they're there voluntarily because their legal representative living in the villa agreed for them to be there. And obviously, as you might suspect, there could be a big potential for abuse. Because the villa might have belonged to the person in the cage, and the person living in the villa is quite happy to have that person stripped of legal capacity of living in the cage while he's living in the villa. And all these kinds of abusive situations, I'm sure you didn't expect I would tell you about in relation to my mandate here, the United Nations. But so the range of topics I deal with is vast, and the resources I have are minute. Not only the mandate itself is not paid, so it's a voluntary honorary position, which is great, it's a great privilege, it's a great honor, but it requires me obviously to do also other work. So I can't just deal with 192 countries and all these areas, but I also have to make a living. And I have one full-time employee financed by the UN who basically has to do the whole correspondence and organize all these country visits and the company visits and take all the notes and then prepare draft reports that I can process. And thankfully the Swiss government has now financed the second person. But it is a relentless struggle on a daily basis to actually keep up with these challenges and try to make sense of it and be of added value. So states have to prevent all of these types of abuse happening in their jurisdictions, and I have to, when I evaluate countries, I look at their legal systems, I look at their regulations, I look at the practices, I look at the conditions of detention. I visit 3 prisons a day, surprise visits at the transit prison at the international airport, a surprise visit at a police station, and a surprise visit at a high security prison. And when you go into a high security prison in, say, Turkey with 16,000 detainees, and you have a team of 5, the medical doctor and so on, you have to find your way around to try to find the right place to look at. So it's a quite challenging function to do that. The second obligation, states have to prevent the expulsion, the extradition also, or the refusal at the border of persons who may be exposed to torture in other countries. So they not only have to prevent it in their own territory, but they also cannot expose persons that are in their territory or at the border that ask for their protection. They cannot send them back to other jurisdictions where they may be exposed to torture or treatment. Because you mentioned my engagement for the Assange case, that obviously is the biggest issue now with him facing potential extradition to the United States, and you know that his proceedings are starting on Monday on the first instance court. So that clearly, in my view, is precisely the reason why there is no way that he could lawfully be extradited to the United States. Because we know that national security defendants in the United States, in my view, do not get a fair trial. I'm not saying the US is not a rule of law country, they are. But in national security cases, they're not. Because after 9/11, the practice that has developed of conducting national security trials in the infamous espionage court in Alexandria, Virginia, when you look at how this whole setup is made in this court, it really contradicts the notions of a fair trial. First of all, it's not a coincidence that it's always the federal court in federal district number 4 that is chosen for these trials, because it is the district of Washington, D.C., basically. and it's a trial by jury. So the jury reflects the population. So what's the population around Alexandria? Most of them work for the national security establishment or the government. So when John Kiriakou, who was the CIA agent who actually leaked was the whistleblower on the CIA torture, when he was tried, his jury advisor came to see him and looked at the list of juries and said, look, with this list of potential jurors, you can shuffle it any way you want. You are already convicted. So the only advice I can give to you is to plead guilty. Even if you're innocent, just confess to something and they'll give you 2 years and you will be gone. Otherwise, you're going to get 30 years in prison because there's no chance you're not going to be convicted. And that's the first step. The second step is always the same judge that's presiding. Never different. It's always the same lady that presides these hearings. It's behind closed doors, secret evidence, that may not even be accessible to the defendant. So how can you possibly have a fair trial when you can't access the evidence against you? And there's no public transparency on what's actually going on there. And obviously the argument is always national security, and that's a kind of catch-all phrase that has become a very dangerous fig leaf for dangerous undermining, I would say, strategies for the rule of law and even democracy. You can go into that a bit more deep. But so that is just a fair trial aspect. And then we know that national security convicts, once they are convicted, they're being held in high security prisons and very often under the so-called special administrative measures, which are authorized by the Attorney General, and really are almost impossible to challenge judicially, where the inmates are being held in solitary confinement for years without access to any normal human contact. And we know that, according to the UN standards, any solitary confinement beyond 15 days is defined as prolonged and is by definition cruel, inhuman, or degrading. So it is a very severe measure, because the human mind needs interaction. We are wired that way. We're a social being. If we're isolated completely in empty concrete cells for more than 15 days, we can already, it depends on the person's resilience obviously, but already after 15 days, some people show even irreparable damage. And that's obviously in the extreme case, it would be irreparable, but it can already happen. And the longer it lasts, certainly when we get into months and years, there will be irreparable damage to the nervous system, to the cognitive capacities of other people. So that's why the conditions of detention that would be expected, even if the trial were fair and he was fairly convicted of something, the conditions of detention, in my view, and the view of my predecessor, and the view of all major human rights organizations, these detention conditions in the supermax prisons are by definition a violation of the prohibition of torture and treatment. So that's the normal full law. As I said, it also applies when the Coast Guard picks up boat people outside the territorial waters on the high seas, but they're picked up by a national Coast Guard. These people are now in the jurisdiction of that nation. They can ask for asylum. It means they cannot send them just back. Now they have to evaluate whether sending them back would cause a risk in terms of torture and treatment, also right to life, and that cannot be done on the boat. You have to bring them back to your territory, you have to give them a fair trial. And that's why, especially in the EU, which obviously now is less relevant for you, but the EU has this policy of cooperation with Libya, where the official line is, oh, we finance the Coast Guard, we train them, we equip them so they can save all these poor migrants from the Mediterranean. Obviously, the migrants don't want to be saved, they want to cross the Mediterranean. And they're always saved by the Libyan Coast Guard, so they can be brought back to Libya. They're never being saved by the European Coast Guards, because then they would have to take them to European soil. So that's why it's not about rescuing people. Because rescuing people is not sending them back to a camp where they're going to be ill-treated and raped and murdered or even enslaved. And I think you've probably seen some of these YouTube videos that circulate what is happening to migrants in these camps is utterly inhumane. And in my opinion, the EU is complicit in that. I'm not saying that there's a simple solution, but the solution cannot be to prevent people from leaving a country where they're systematically exposed to gravest violations of human rights. And I say this as a Swiss citizen, with the Swiss history during the Second World War to close the border and tell the Jews at the border, our boat is full. And what happened to them afterwards, we all know. That's not acceptable. Yes, it would have been difficult to accommodate everybody. It would have been politically dangerous. But if we're not ready to stand up for these values, then we are compromised. And we will have to pay the price at some point for that. So, prevention in your territory, and you can't send people out and expose them to, and you have to, when they ask for your protection, you have to grant them protection from torture and treatment. It can also be in the embassies. And when it comes to your embassy, it happened after Tiananmen confrontations in '89 in Beijing, when some of the activists sought refuge in the US embassy because they were being pursued by the Chinese authorities. There also, there is a duty to give diplomatic asylum if not giving it would mean that the person gets exposed to torture or treatment. The third one is that every victim in the territory of the country has been victim of torture, has entitled to redress and rehabilitation. So it have to provide these facilities that can be legal measures that we can take if the government itself is responsible for the torture, but certainly medical measures. Even if it's a migrant coming from a country where they have been tortured, it's our medical system that has to provide them with the facilities and treatments that are necessary to rehabilitate them. Now that's extremely expensive. And I hate to say it in terms of monetary terms, but torture is not only inhumane, it's also economically disastrous. It causes so much destruction. To rehabilitate someone who has been broken is almost impossible. And just to make them function again as a family member and as an employee can take years. So torture destroys the innermost core of a personality. That's what it aims to do. It's not here just to make you feel uncomfortable. It wants to break your will. And that is something that's broken. It just doesn't grow together anymore. You can't just fix it. You can't just glue it together. And so the damage that torture does, you don't have a notion of it. You may be watching 24 and Jack Power, saving the world 2 minutes before Coca-Cola was its commercial break. Right? So if they only have 2 minutes left, obviously we'll have to throw in a little bit of torture to make the bad guy speak and expose the location of the ticking bomb. And it always works. Yeah? We even know that in some of the black sites of the CIA, the main favorite TV series was 24. When they practiced the same thing every day, they waterboarded this man, Khalid Mohammed, one of the suspected main conspirators of 9/11. They waterboarded him 183 times. Now, waterboarding is drowning you until you pass out. That's the painful part of drowning. Once you pass out, you don't feel it anymore. You die. So you take them from awake to passing out 183 times. Asphyxiation, just imagine it. Try to put your head under water once and then do that until you pass out. That's waterboarding. And they acknowledged that they did not get any, emphasize any, useful information out of them. So if you've done it 120 times and it did not provide you with anything useful, why are you going to continue another 63 times? At the same time, these people watch 24. It has nothing to do with the reality of torture. You can never get a terrorist to tell you where a ticking bomb is by torturing them. Just think about it. If he knows where the bomb is and it is ticking, whatever he tells you, you will stop torturing him, because you have to go and check. And while you're checking, there's no point in torturing him, right? So why would he tell you where it is? It will just have to send you somewhere else. That's exactly what he did. They made up that. This would torture to stop. And gave them leads that would take a lot of time to verify. And then they go, and then you come back and you've lost time and the bomb is ticking. So the ticking bomb scenario is not realistic because it does not correspond to the normal behavior, even in extreme circumstances, of human beings. They will give you wrong leads until the bomb is placed. Now, if the person doesn't know where the bomb is, well then, obviously, torture will be of no use either. And the question of whether the person really knows or doesn't know, the point, you're torturing him because you don't know if he knows. So you can't know whether he really knows or whether what he tells you is correct or not. So really what torture is, it's a method of science that was used in the 15th, 16th century, right? When some people came along and said, actually the world is round. And then the church would torture them until they admit it's flat. It is a method of coercing people to say what you want them to say, to confirm your expectations. You're already suspecting, even genuinely maybe, that someone is a criminal, has committed a crime. If you torture him, you will get him to confirm your expectation, because if he doesn't, you will keep torturing him until he does. So it really is not something that is, it's a lousy method of fact-finding, but it's a very effective measure of coercion. Torture is practiced throughout the world, despite the prohibition, not because it does not work. Trump is right, it works, but it doesn't work for fact-finding. It works for coercion, it works for intimidation. That's why in conflicts, women are raped on the village square. It's not because they want to make her confess the truth or something like this, but because they intimidate everybody else. And obviously it's very effective. But it's effective for absolutely immoral purposes. There is no legitimate purpose for which torture is effective. In science, we have moved away from torturing people to find out if the planet is round or flat. And I can personally, as I introduced in my introduction, confirm that astronaut Gene Cernan, who commanded the last inhumane, has confirmed the Earth is round. He has actually seen it himself. So we've moved a lot from that. This microphone, all of this, you can't create with torture, but only with objective fact-finding. In interrogation throughout the world, in police stations, we're still in the 16th century. Police officers are still coercing people to say what they want to hear, because they have piles of police reports that they haven't resolved, and their promotion depends, in most countries, on how well they do in resolving these crimes. So they go out, they pick up some poor people on the street, and they take them to the office, and they say, look, you confess to these 10 crimes, we'll find a deal with the prosecutor, get 3 months to go out. You don't confess, we'll give you a rough treatment, and then you'll be in for 5 years. And this is how, honestly, in many countries in the world, the low end of the police stations, how crime is being resolved statistically. In the US, if I get the numbers right, more than 90% of cases, criminal cases, are being resolved by plea bargains. It's possible that this refers only to certain crimes, so don't, say there's an absolute, maybe the percentage and overall slightly lower, but it's enormous. Plea bargains, which is again, it can be a legitimate measure when someone is willing to cooperate and confess something he's really done. But if, as in the national security trial, the prospect is I'll get an unfair trial where I have no chance to be acquitted and actually make my point heard, or I'll confess to something I haven't done, that's not justice. Right? That's not fact-finding either. That really goes into an area that we really shouldn't be moving in. Fourth, there's 5 of them. There's the exclusionary rule. No information that has been obtained through torture may ever be used in a proceeding. So a confession, a testimony, classically, that has been obtained through torture cannot be used in a criminal proceeding. That is not only, it's the poisonous fruit, really, of torture. Because as soon as you allow, even if it's true, it cannot be used. Because obviously, once you allow this being used, then you'll have the practice of torture will be almost impossible to prevent. Here also we have an extradition proceeding in Switzerland where a woman from the Basque part of Spain, and you may know that there's a secessionist movement in this small Basque region in Spain with also some violent exchanges, terrorist activities, and in 1998 she was arrested by the Spanish police in that region, and she was suspected of cooperating with the ETA movement. She was suffocated with a plastic bag on her head and taken to a cellar where she was detained for 5 days and sexually assaulted by police until she confessed. And then she confessed to have collaborated with the ETA. That is her description of the facts. She was then sentenced to 11 years in prison in Spanish court, and because she was on bail, she escaped undercover with fake passports and her small daughter to Switzerland, where she lived undercover for a number of years until Spanish intelligence, for some reason, I don't know whether in Switzerland, they found her and asked for extradition. And the Swiss Ministry of Justice basically just signed this, yes, okay, there's a criminal judgment, we have an extradition treaty, we'll send her. And she made the claim, well, but I have been tortured. My confession, that is the basis for the judgment, that is the basis for the extradition request, was obtained under torture. And she went to her lawyers had her examined by 2 independent medical experts, world-renowned for examining torture victims, and both came to the conclusion that she shows all the symptoms that would be typical for a person who has gone through that type of abuse, and her account is consistent with what happened. It is known to have been the tactics and practice, unfortunately, of the Spanish police in several cases at that time, at that place. And there have been cases in Strasbourg that the Human Rights Court have also confirmed that. And our federal criminal court then went on, they came out with a decision I cannot comprehend still, saying that, oh yes, this woman submitted 5,000 pages of evidence for her torture claim, but we don't have to look into this because we know that Spain is a country with a democratic tradition. As if countries with democratic traditions would not torture. We know that not only since Guantanamo, and we can go to the Middle East, we can go to this country, any country, but honestly, there is no country where torture doesn't happen. It may not be a state policy, but it happens. Individual police officers, interrogators, it happens. Psychiatric institutions and so on. So I did an intervention, that's just to illustrate how I work. I received this, and I intervened with the Swiss government, and also went public at some point and said that that this was contradictory to the obligations here of the exclusionary rule, that extradition request was based on an invalid judgment because it was based on an invalid confession. And I threatened to expose the evidence for this, and 10 days later, the Spanish withdrew the extradition request, which was obviously an elegant way out, because otherwise it would have gone to our Supreme Court, which then probably would have had to look at the evidence, and it would have caused the Swiss authorities, but also the Spanish authorities to lose face in this case. So these are the types of interventions I made. So before she was extradited, the Spanish authorities then withdrew that request. That was a case where it did work. In the prominent case of Julian Assange, it has not worked so far. But that was just to illustrate what the exclusionary rule means and why it is so important. And then finally, states have to investigate, prosecute, and punish every act of torture. That's not in the discretion. There is no discretion for states to decide they don't want to investigate. As soon as there is reasonable grounds to believe that an act of torture has been committed, a state must promptly and impartially investigate that, and if violations have happened, must prosecute and punish the perpetrators. That is a big issue I have with this country here. I did not think that that would happen. I'm a professor myself in Glasgow, and I hold, the rule of law tradition of the UK in very high respect. But you know that the Intelligence and Security Committee of the Parliament published 2 reports last year. Actually, it was 2018 now, so it's the year before last, on the UK involvement in the CIA rendition and torture policy. And it came to the conclusion that the involvement of the UK was much more substantial than thought beforehand, and requested additional evidence, and the government actually refused to give evidence to the Parliament, and so they asked for a judicial inquiry. Some of you may know the story. There was also the Gibson report, 2013, and so the government then suspended this and said, we have some police investigations that have to go through, and we'll do it eventually. That's the short story of it. And then Prime Minister Johnson came into office. One of his first acts in office was to cancel that and say, we're not going to do a judicial inquiry into the UK involvement in torture treatment. Now, that is unlawful. So I intervened the UK and said, there is no discretion. You have to, your government, it's not just an allegation, your government confirmed that there was a much more substantial involvement of the UK in this policy, and torture is an international crime that needs to be prosecuted, so you have to conduct a judicial inquiry. It does not mean that everybody needs to be, subjected to draconian punishments. Some people will then claim, well, I was almost coerced, I was a low-rank soldier or agent, and my government, my superiors ordered me to do this. It does not excuse it, but it will be mitigating, but obviously it leads higher up in the authorities. And that's usually where these prosecutions don't take place. Some people have been prosecuted in the UK for violating the laws of armed conflict or human rights in these conflict areas. Some have been prosecuted in the US. But it's never people that actually complied with orders by the government. It's usually the kind of rogue actors that did their own thing. But as soon as you have soldiers and agents that actually carry out orders and official policy, and the CIA program obviously was official policy, then that does not work. No one, actually, one CIA agent has been prosecuted in the US for the torture policy, and it was John Kiriakou, the whistleblower, because he exposed it. So he has been prosecuted, but none of the torturers, not a single one. And the law is clear. As it was conducted and committed, perpetrated in the context of an armed conflict, these are even war crimes. So we're in a very serious area of criminal law, and not a single prosecution has taken place. And so now this example that the US has set is being followed by the UK, both P5 countries that obviously extremely powerful and influential in the world. And so now how should I go and promote this rule here? Investigate, prosecute, and punish when I go to visit the Maldives last November, with 500,000 inhabitants, and they've had hundreds of complaints, and none have been prosecuted. So why would they do that now? Why would they actually want to do it? Because the present government, they were very interested, I was very surprised, very interested in what the conditions are like in prison, and we really want to improve this and tell us and so on. I said, well, why are you so, I mean, it's great, but usually governments are not so keen to invest in prisons. And I said, well, the previous government actually kept all of us in prison. So they were all, basically all the ministers and police chiefs and so on, they were straight out of prison and then were elected into their functions. And then they said, but it's not because of that, it's because we know that we risk to go back there. So we really want to clean up the places before we have to return. So this is, but usually there's already, prisons are not the places, even in the most democratic states, where governments like to invest because it's just not as attractive as schools and hospitals and roads and these types of things. So prisons usually are not very beautiful places. But when you see these examples of powerful countries passing the message that the crime of torture no longer has to be prosecuted, I think we are in a very dangerous place. And that again links to the WikiLeaks case, where I went to visit Mr. Assange, reluctantly, I have to admit, a bit to my shame. And his lawyers contacted me in December 2018 and asked me for my intervention. I basically said, I still see that. I was working on my computer and there comes this new mail that the reference line was, Assange's legal team asked for your protection. And I immediately thought, no, I'm not going to be manipulated by this narcissist and rapist and hacker and spy. And it took me a couple of hours to even look at that email. And I didn't really, I have to, I receive about 15 requests a day, and I can deal with maybe one or two. So I thought, this is not going to be one of them. And so they came back 3 months later and said, we have information that his expulsion from the embassy is imminent, and please do something. Look at, here are 3 pieces of evidence, please just look at this before you make up your mind. And I felt I owed it to my professional integrity to do so, and I opened some of these documents, and as soon as you scratch the surface, you see the contradictions coming up. And the deeper you go, the more dirty it becomes. And I really, I'm not a headline hunter. Go back in the last 20 years of my career, I've never made the headlines. And I've seen lots of dirty crimes in my life. But I've never seen democratic states to actually, as I said, also publicly gang up to persecute a person and isolate him and humiliate him and push him into the corner with so little regard for his human rights, just due process rights. In Ecuador, in the US, in Sweden, in the UK, his due process rights have been systematically and seriously violated. I thought on the 11th of April, when he was expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy, without any due process, by the way, he was stripped of his asylum status that he had for 6.5 years, and he was stripped even of his citizenship that he had of Ecuador. They took that away just by decision of the president. No due process. It was just informed. Your asylum is finished. Your citizenship, you're no longer a citizen of our country. Go. basically. He didn't want to go. British police came and arrested him. I'm not saying you can't strip someone of nationality and asylum status, but it is a procedure under the rule of law. It means you have a right to have a legal representation. You can't just do this on the spot. That's just one example. And when he was arrested by the UK, though, I thought, well, at least now he's in the UK. So now we'll have the rule of law. He's going to have, a hospital for a trial. And, obviously he will not be, deported to the US, given the risks. But I cannot believe that this man, to this day, the day before his trial, he's not had the right to call his US lawyers once. How is that possible? He's been extradited to the US. He's not been able to speak to his lawyers in the United States. He's had visits by his UK lawyers, but they've been extremely obstructed. He's not been able to take documents to his cell to actually prepare his defense. And it's a very complex case. But they prefer family visits for other prisoners, and I think that's important, but he's being kept. He's not, he's served his sentence for bail violation. And so now he's being kept preventatively only. So he's not a criminal convict. And he doesn't have sufficient access to even discuss the evidence he will present in his hearings. How is that possible? And it's not about whether he's a good man or a bad man. He's just a defendant in a, extradition trial, so he should have the right to prepare his defense. On the other side, there is the world superpower with I don't know how many hundreds of lawyers and, to prepare this trial against him. His Swedish lawyer, when the proceeding was still going on, came to London to visit him in Belmarsh to present the legal document of the court to Assange. It's a 300-page Swedish language document. And so he wanted to translate it to him, summarize it to him. He was not allowed to leave a translation with him, or even to leave the original with him, which obviously would have been useful because he doesn't speak Swedish. So he had a 2-hour slot to see him. He arrived on time, but the prison brought Julian Assange to him 1 hour and 45 minutes later. So he had exactly 15 minutes to orally explain to him what was in this document. And obviously it was completely useless. And these types of things are just consistent in this case. I worked at the court. I've worked, in the foreign affairs of Switzerland as the national security policy advisor. So I know that national security establishments have legitimate interests in the confidentiality of information. I know that no legal proceeding is always perfect. That's why we have several instances. It's not always bad faith, we're just humans. We make mistakes, some shortcuts, and some intentional, some unintentional. But when one defendant in all 4 jurisdictions, in every stage of every proceeding, his rights are being violated, and no remedy ever works, it's not a coincidence. And it's simply very dangerous. I've written lots about these Swedish proceedings, very delicate to get into, especially as a white man in the times of Me Too, and then to challenge a rape allegation and say, there are indications, at least part of it may be fabricated. Very dangerous area to go into. I hesitated very long. I thought I put my credibility on the line. But when I received text messages, copies of text messages that were sent by these women from the police station where she writes, I'm at the police station. I don't want to blame Assange for anything. I just want him to take an HIV test, but the police wants to get their hands on him. And the next day she writes to her friend, I didn't want to blame him for anything, but the police fabricated the charges. She writes that. Would a raped woman write that? No. You see, she goes, how does it work? In practice, and I've worked next to the police office at the court, People come to the police station, they sit down, they report a crime, the police officers write it down in the interview, then both sides read it, sign it, and then it's given to the prosecutor. It's always the same. The prosecutor looks at it and decides whether he or she wants to investigate or not, or needs more information. That's the choreography, that's the sequencing. There, if you look at the timestamps of the original documents, the woman arrives at the police station. The interview starts at 1600, I think. At 1700, she's still sitting in the office being interviewed by the police officer. The prosecutor informs the police officer and the woman that Assange will be arrested for suspected rape. Now, how's that possible? How did the prosecutor know about that? Because the prosecutor was not in the office and she was still reporting to the police. The prosecutor already knew what she was going to do. The woman hears it, gets emotionally so distraught, but that's not what I wanted, sends this message to a friend, and I don't want to blame him, they want to get their hands on him, interrupts the questioning, goes home, refuses to sign. But that evening, the tabloid press says that the prosecutor confirmed to the tabloid press that Assange was being wanted for double rape. How's that possible? And the second woman, because we're talking about double rape, was questioned the next day. So the headline is the evening before. How is that possible? How can the prosecutor confirm to the tabloid press that the second woman was raped, or the first one that didn't want to sign, and the second one that was questioned over the next day by the police? And so you have all these contradictions, and you say, well, something's wrong here. So I submitted this to the, and I hate to get in, I'm a Swedish and Swiss citizen, so I can read the original documents. But I love my countries, both of them. But when I see this, well, I submit this to the government because I don't want to come out with conspiracy theories easily. And I said, could you please explain to me what the reason, I mean, what are the alternative explanations here? And he said, oh, no comments. And usually when I contact democratic rule of law states, because that's what I'm mandated to do by the United Nations, to ask questions, to clarify things, and states are called by the United Nations to cooperate with me. Well, they respond. Not all states do, but by and large, mature democracies are very detailed. The UK, a year ago, in a different case, a 6-page response that they found the victim, they discussed, they found a settlement, without acknowledging responsibility for torture, but both parties were fine. So they engage. Even Russia sends me 10-page responses saying, we went to the prison, we talked to the guard, his name is so-and-so, that's what he said, that's what the director said. So even China sends them to me in Chinese, so it takes a while for me to get a translation. And I'm not saying that all the responses I receive are genuine and constructive, but I get responses. The states that say, we reject all allegations and have no further comments, are usually the states that cannot engage in dialogue because they have no valid responses to these questions. They're very aware of the misconduct. So what does that mean? When the defendant no longer has the right to prepare his defense, and his due process rights have been systematically violated. When the UN rapporteur intervenes, and I may be wrong, but engage, you don't have to agree with me as a state, but you have to engage with me and give me the responses of why I'm wrong. And that's the whole purpose of it. If they no longer engage with the institutions they have created to monitor their compliance with the obligations they have ratified, because they don't want to be exposed. But entire books across the Atlantic get classified because it would be embarrassing for the president to have them published. That's not national security, that's personal security. And that's not the point of government confidentiality. If it becomes a crime to expose serious government misconduct that could not be reported in a different way effectively, and we see that even when they're published like this, there is no effective No one is being prosecuted for collateral murder. No one is being prosecuted for systematic torture. No one is being prosecuted for clear aggression of Iraq without a million, casualties afterwards. So there is no remedy. There is impunity. But we're going after the people that expose these things. And I'm not saying, WikiLeaks did everything perfectly. No, probably they didn't. But it's a bit of a new type of actor that appeared in reaction to growing tendencies of the national security state to keep things secret and away from their populations. Do we need regulations? Maybe we do. But we certainly need rule of law where we deal with government power. Democracies, the power belongs to the people, they're delegated to the governments. Governments have to respond to us on how to use their power. They will not tell us, because what we get back is 3 pages of black text, right? Many of the FOIA requests that are being submitted, the response looks like that. The entire page is simply black. So if you're not receiving responses, well, you turn to actors like WikiLeaks. It's natural. Because if you don't know what your government is doing, and if others tell you they are spies and they're being sent to America to go to prison for 175 years, who will tell you what's the truth in the future? If that precedence goes through, who will tell you the truth? No one. It's going to be too dangerous. And once that bubble is created, where we are no longer allowed to have the truth, are we still a democracy? Are we still able to control what our government is doing with the power we give them? I want you to think about that. How fundamental that threat really is. So, what do we have in the UN as institutions to fight against torture? There is the, I have to slightly technologically challenge. There's the UN Committee Against Torture. It's the committee that implements the convention that I just presented to you, the 5 obligations, prevention, non-refoulement, prosecution, investigation, and the non-use of the poisonous fruit of torture. It's a committee of 10 experts that can also deal with individual cases, can make recommendations to states, but its decisions are not legally binding. Obviously, this committee deals only with countries that have ratified the treaty. Again, it's not to bore you, but when I'm down here, you'll see why this is important. Again, to the treaty that only has been ratified by a lot of countries, and I think it's 160 or something so far, so it's a lot of countries. But I make a mistake with the numbers because of various treaties. The subcommittee, there's an optional protocol to that treaty. If you ratify it, you allow that committee to come to your country and visit prisons and so on. The UK is party to that optional protocol, and so that subcommittee can visit, and the state are obliged to give them access to their prisons and to talk to detainees without witnesses. The drawback is very strong frameworks, monitoring mechanisms. The optional protocol also obliges states to have national preventive mechanisms that can actually visit prisons within the country more regularly. They're very strong, but they're only binding, obviously, for states that have ratified the treaty. Now, my mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur is not treaty-bound. Well, it's based on the UN Charter, basically, but it's a mandate that's given by the Human Rights Council and appointed by states for 3 years, once renewable, and now in my 4th year, so I'll have another 2, and then I'll have to give up that mandate and someone else will take over. But it covers all of the United Nations, member states, plus aspiring member states. For example, the UN subcommittee wanted to visit the Ukrainian areas of Donetsk and Luhansk that are held by rebels. The Ukraine is a part of the treaty, so the Ukraine has to give them access. But when they were at the checkpoint for the that were controlled by the rebels said, you know, we are the independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. We are not the Ukraine, and actually, we'd be happy to ratify your treaty, and then you can visit. But because if you don't let us ratify, you don't recognize our independence and let us ratify, you can't visit the prisons. Now, I went back to the Ukraine in 2018 to visit as the UN Special Rapporteur, and then they gave me access, because they're an aspiring UN member state. And they felt it would give them credibility to receive me and to discuss with me on that level. So you can see that whether I get access or not to a state or to a territory that wants to be a state is very much a political thing. I can visit, but states are not obliged to give me access. They can opt not to give me access. They're called, they should do it, but they don't have to do it. Usually they say, oh, you're very welcome to come, but not right now. We have elections this year and next year and the year after, but afterwards maybe. And so, especially the countries that should be visited, unfortunately usually don't invite me. And the ones that don't really need the visits, they're happy to do so, because obviously my report is going to be harsh in terms to deal with politically. This is about a very delicate topic. But just to illustrate what's the added value of this mandate is really that I can be much more flexible. I have, I don't have 25 experts, it's me and my 2 assistants, but I'm very flexible, I can react quickly, I don't have an authority above me, I'm not even allowed to take instructions from any governments, not even the United Nations Secretary General is allowed to give me instructions, the High Commissioner for Human Rights cannot give me instructions, they provide my secretariat. So for the terms that I have been appointed, I'm completely independent and can act, and that's the reason I can take up hot potatoes like Assange and actually deal with it, because no one else will do it. Even the High Commissioner for Human Rights doesn't want to touch the issue, because everyone feels they're going to be infected by him. So that is the strength, and that's what I used to do as a rapporteur. I focus on these difficult issues: domestic violence, migration, corruption, psychological tortures. I'm going to present next week to the Human Rights Council in Geneva a report on what psychological torture is, and individual cases like Manning and Assange. I'm talking a lot. I promise I'll be involved. So these were the thematic reports I did. I mentioned them already. This is a view on my team. Then we visit Argentina. So you see the human face of it. But I will conclude here, and I'll be really happy if now you could ask some questions. And I will just repeat your questions in the microphone, so those that are not in this room will actually hear your questions, so you don't have to wait for a microphone to go around. But I'll be happy to talk not only about torture, also about other things you want to, that might be interesting for you.